Hi, this is Todd Boland. I'm the horticulturist at the MUN Botanical Garden, and the PowerPoint you're about to watch now is part of your grocery store botany lab. Now, most of this particular lab is all about going to a grocery store, purchasing different types of fresh produce, trying to figure out what parts of a plant each of these products come from. What you probably didn't think about, though, were some of the products that we actually drink. Okay, so primarily coffee, tea, and cocoa. So this little PowerPoint will give you an overview about the production and how these particular products are created and where they come from. Okay, this particular graph right here shows you a map of the world and looks at what parts of the world are primarily tea drinkers versus coffee drinkers. You can see in Canada, where slightly more than 50% of us would be considered coffee drinkers. Down in the States, on the other hand, are primarily coffee drinkers and much of South America. On the other side of the coin, when you look at parts of much of Asia, including the UK as well, they're primarily tea drinkers, okay? So I've done surveys before in previous labs when we were able to get together as a class, and strangely enough, seems like most people in Newfoundland are actually tea drinkers more so than they are coffee drinkers. So the map that's showing here of Canada as being primarily coffee is probably a bit skewed towards the larger population centers. Okay, so I'm going to start off specifically talking about coffee first. So the annual coffee consumption worldwide around 400 billion cups. Okay, that's hard to get your head wrapped around that. So that works out to being about 12,000 cups of coffee every second worldwide. Okay, that's pretty awesome when you think about it for the amount of coffee that's being consumed on a regular basis. So in 1 year, if you just drink 2 cups of coffee a day, you're going to consume the annual harvest that comes from 18 coffee bushes. Okay, and 2 cups of coffee is not a lot when you think about it. So I mean, if you're 4 cups, well, then you're talking about 36 coffee bushes that are devoted just to you. Okay, 18 coffee bushes are going to take up the space of most standard classrooms, okay, around the campus. Okay, so where did coffee come from? There's actually 124 different types of coffee, and all originate from Africa. But now our coffee only comes from 2 species. We have the what we call the Arabica coffee, and you often see advertisements saying coffee is 100% Arabica. And the other important one is a species called Canephora, which is more commonly known as Robusta coffee. Okay, both of these particular coffee species are native to the Ethiopian highlands. So for the most part here in North America, we drink primarily Arabica coffee. It's considered to be a higher quality, but it does actually have less caffeine than Robusta coffee would have. Now, Arabica coffee has to be mountain grown. So you see advertisements on TV for like Folgers coffee, and they say mountain grown coffee. So most of the Arabica coffee that we grow in the world are all grown in mountainous regions, albeit tropical. On the other hand, a Robusta coffee can grow at lower elevations. So that can grow in more typical tropical rainforests, we'll say. Okay, so we're back to another map of the world, and this is showing you the primarily coffee producing areas of the world. So what you're seeing on this map are areas that are sort of that beigey, yellowy type color are growing primarily Arabica coffee, which is mostly Central America and much of South America and some areas in Africa. Areas in dark green are growing mostly Robusta coffee, that's primarily African. And then areas in pale green are growing a combination of both. Okay, so coffee was first consumed in Yemen during Sufi rituals around 1450s, they think, but it's quickly spread throughout the Middle East. Okay, so areas around Israel, and Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, those are the primarily first coffee drinking areas of the world. And of course, Turkey would be part of that as well as part of the Middle East. So it was introduced to Europe around the 1600s from Dutch traders that were visiting, bringing in goods from Turkey. So the first coffee houses opened in Italy in 1645. So think of it, that's your first Starbucks that opened up was back in 1645. And the Dutch were very important when it came to coffee. And it was the Dutch East Indian Company that introduced coffee plants to Java and Sri Lanka in Indonesia in the early 1600s. So they transplanted plants from Africa and started to move them around the world. So the French, of course, were very important with the coffee production, and the French introduced coffee to Haiti in 1734. And by 1788, Haiti was producing half of the world's production of coffee. And of course, most of that coffee was all going to the coffee houses of Europe. It was introduced to Brazil in 1727, okay, and that was mostly by the Portuguese, but it took about 100 years to gain momentum in that country. And why we are talking specifically about Brazil is because today Brazil is the #1 producer of coffee in the world, okay? So since 1852, in fact, so almost 100, basically 150 years plus, Brazil has been the world's leading producer of coffee. However, coffee is grown in mountainous tropical regions in over 70 countries. Primarily, I'm referring to here now as the Arabica coffee, which does need to be mountain grown. And it's often the most important commodity in many of these developing countries. As I mentioned, the largest producer of coffee in the world is Brazil, and they are producing approximately 33% of the world's production. But other big coffee producing areas of the world include Vietnam, Colombia, of course, what we think about, Indonesia, and Mexico. And one thing to consider about these coffee plantations, that most of them are family owned. They're only small, as opposed to being huge plantations, and are basically run by family and their immediate relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that. So since 1920, the US has been the main consumer of coffee for the world, okay? So most of it's produced in Brazil, but the biggest coffee drinkers in the world are Americans, okay? And actually 50% of the world's coffee production is actually transported to the United States. So here's a typical view. And as you can see, coffee plants are usually kept fairly small, usually kept at around 5 to 6 feet in height. And the main reason for that is because they all had to be hand-picked. So there's no point of allowing the bushes because they can't get taller. There's no point in them getting higher than that because it's just too difficult to try to pick them by hand. So it's a very labor intensive. It can't be done by machinery. These people are not getting paid a heck of a lot for gathering it. But, you know, as soon as you're basically old enough to start picking coffee, you know, your families are going to expect you to be out there. Now, one thing to keep in mind with coffee is that it's not a year-round thing. Usually coffee produces 2 crops a year, okay? So for 2 times of the year, it's quite labor-intensive. So getting back to coffee facts, it does take about 4 years for a new coffee plant to yield its first fruit, okay? So from the time you plant a new seed to the time you get your first fruit, it's going to be about 4 years. And the coffee beans are actually 2 seeds from a cherry-like berry, okay? So the fruit that the coffee beans come from is botanically referred to as a berry. Timing is critical, okay? If you pick them too early, they're going to be poor quality. If you leave them too long, however, I'm calling them the cherries, but it's only because they look like cherries. The fruit are basically can be knocked off by heavy rain, okay? So the fruit, when it's ripe, will be red in color, okay? So it basically tells you that it's ready to be picked, but it does have to be hand-picked. The seeds had to be extracted from the fruit. The seeds are dried, sorted, roasted, ground, and then finally brewed into coffee, okay? So there's a lot of steps that are involved from the harvesting of the fruit until you get your first cup of coffee. Now, you may also come across the term shade-grown coffee, okay? And shade-grown coffee should be more ecologically sound because, of course, the problem with coffee plantations and tea and cocoa when the time comes is that they basically cause all the existing forest to be cleared, okay, in order to grow these particular crops. But with shade-grown coffee, you're basically growing the coffee under the shade of existing trees. Now, in theory, that should be good because it allows some existing trees to survive so that wildlife can exist in those trees above and beyond the coffee plants growing down below. But in this particular image right here, they actually are shade grown under the shade of bananas, okay? So you're basically getting a double crop off the land here, but it's still, from an ecological point of view, it's a little bit of a sterile desert. Here are the flowers, okay? So what happens with coffee? You get 2 crops a year. So you get your flowers, then you get your berries, which go from green to red. When they're ready to be picked. Once they're all picked, then the tree takes about a 6-month hiatus, and then it starts producing another crop again, okay? So it's 2 crops a year. When you cut the fruit open, you can see the coffee bean inside. The coffee bean is actually white until it's roasted. It's not until it's roasted that it actually starts to develop the coffee fragrance. Now, the flavor of coffee is determined upon the growing conditions as much as the roasting process, okay? So you'll find there's coffee grown, you know, you go to your Starbucks and you can get Costa Rican coffee, Brazilian coffee, Ecuador coffee. You can get coffee from Indonesia. Examples right here are Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee and Kona coffee, which is from Hawaii. So the price can vary dramatically. The cheapest coffee in the world is going to be those that is grown in companies that grow a lot of it. So Brazil, okay, being the biggest producer, are going to have the cheapest coffee. If you're only growing a limited number of plants, such as Jamaican Blue Mountain, it's only basically on a couple of mountainsides that it's grown, or Kona coffee, which is only grown on the big island of Hawaii, because of supply and demand, there's not a lot of supply, a lot of demand, and the price can be raised accordingly, okay? And of course, flavors can vary dramatically amongst coffees as well. Okay, so some coffees can have a nut-like aftertaste, and some can be more sweet, some can be more bitter. So again, it all depends upon the growing conditions, as well as the roasting process, as I mentioned. Okay, so we'll leave coffee behind. We'll move now to tea. Excuse me. Tea is the second most popular beverage in the world after water. Okay, so there are far more tea drinkers in the world really than there are coffee drinkers, only because, of course, tea is drank primarily in Asia, which has got the world's largest populations. So China and India account for 62% of the world's tea production, okay? So you always think about China in particular as being a big tea producer. However, Kenya is actually the biggest tea exporter in the world, okay? Surpassing China by over 30,000 tons per year, okay? So what's happening is that, in fact, most of the tea that's grown in China and India are consumed within those countries. Kenya, on the other hand, are the biggest exporters. So they're exporting their tea throughout the world to the big multi-conglomerate tea producers, like, think people like the Red Rose tea or Tetley tea. Those kind of teas, which are being sold all over the world, are mostly being grown in Kenya, okay? So all that China and India are exporting are the highest quality teas, okay? So that you may be able to find those in specialty tea shops, but the vast majority of tea that we go to our supermarkets and purchase there are actually tea that's being grown in Kenya. So tea itself has been consumed in China for over 5,000 years, all right? So it was introduced to Europe from China by Portuguese people in the mid-1500s. So it's interesting because we always think about, the British were being the big tea drinkers, but it was actually introduced to Europe by the Portuguese. Today, 90% of the Western tea market, so basically the tea market in Europe and North America, is controlled by 7 corporations, okay? So it's big business compared to coffee. So it's grown on huge parcels of land in Asia and Africa. Essentially, we're not growing tea in South America, okay? And it's still growing on large large plantation that were originally established by the British Empire, okay? So the British, especially over in India, basically the British took over India primarily as a place where they could grow their tea. So you can see here a typical tea plantation, and you can see from an ecological point of view, it's really quite dramatic, okay? All the existing vegetation is clear cut, and all the hillsides are basically just put out as a monoculture of tea. Okay, so tea originally came from China, all right? So there's only one species of tea. So with coffee, there could be 2, but with tea, it all comes from the one. And a typical tea bush will produce, the harvest from one tea bush is about 3,000 tea leaves per year, which will be processed to create only 1 pound of processed tea, okay? So again, if tea is being drank next to water as being the most consumed beverage, then you're talking about a lot of the world has to be clear cut in order to be able to grow tea plants. Harvesting of an individual plant takes place every 7 to 14 days, year round. Unlike coffee, which is 2 crops a year, tea is harvested year round, every week to 2 weeks. And again, like coffee, it's all done by hand. So here you have a tea plantation in Kenya. Again, like the coffee plants, tea is kept even shorter because it's a lot easier to harvest the crop if it's down sort of at waist height. There are different types of tea, okay? And I'm not referring here now to herbal teas because that's a completely different group of tea made from other parts of a plant. But the actual true tea that's developed from the tea plant, you still have different types of tea, okay? And each of those will have different amounts of caffeine or antioxidants, and it all depends upon how it's treated. Are the leaves wilted? Are they rolled? Are they fermented? Are they roasted? And finally dried. So here's a close-up of the tea leaves. And tea does produce a rather attractive little flower on it, but the flower is irrelevant because in this case, we're only gathering the leaves. We're not gathering the fruit. And the coffee, you're actually gathering the fruit. So the flowers are very important. The more flowers you get, the more fruit you get. With a tea plant, it doesn't matter how many flowers it produces because you're only harvesting the leaves. Okay, so there's 4 main teas that you can purchase that are actually made from the true tea plant. You have white tea. White tea is the least processed. In this case here, only the tips of the new growth is harvested. Okay, so you don't even have a full leaf. You only have the very, very top most starting to develop little leaves. Okay, they have very little caffeine, but they're very, very high in antioxidants. And antioxidants are these cancer-fighting properties that you find in a lot of food. So really, white tea is the healthiest of all the teas. Green tea, very, very popular. In this case, it's the topmost 2 to 3 full leaves. They're picked and they're dried. They're not bruised in any way, shape, or form. So therefore, they still contain a lot of antioxidants, but again, relatively low caffeine. So healthy, we'll say. Then you get oolong tea. Okay, that's a very specialized tea. It is what we call semi-fermented. So it is bruised. So what they do is when they pick those leaves, they actually crush the leaves in their hand before they throw them into the basket. And that bruising process will start an oxidization, and that oxidization destroys the antioxidants, but a byproduct of that is caffeine production. Okay, so now oolong tea is no longer as good as far as antioxidants are concerned, but it's far better when you're starting to get that sort of caffeine punch, we'll say. Most of the tea, on the other hand, that we're harvesting, we're drinking, like your Tetley tea and your red rose tea, is what we call black tea. So those leaves are completely crushed before it's dried. Therefore, all the antioxidants are destroyed, but you actually get then the maximum caffeine production taking place. So black tea is going to give you that buzz in the morning compared to any of the other types of tea. And people often say, you know, which has more caffeine, tea or coffee? And black tea presumably has about half of the caffeine content of most coffee. Okay, so 2 cups of tea for every cup of coffee in order to get your caffeine buzz. Now, there's a lot of problems associated with the production of tea, even more so than with coffee. Okay, so you have low wages. The problem in Africa, which is Kenya being the largest producer in the world, is you have a lot of child labor. So there's a lot of laws that are taking place now, human rights violations, we'll say. Okay, poor working conditions. As I mentioned, environmentally, it's a disaster. And tea does actually require a lot of use of pesticides. Okay, so it's hard to grow organic tea. And what happens with conventional tea production is also characterized by gender division. Okay, it's the women that do all the work. The men sit back, they supervise, and I put that in quotations. Okay, basically they sit back and watch the women do all the work. And oftentimes men get paid a lot more than what the women do. With coffee, on the other hand, it's a whole family affair. Mom, dad, the children, cousins, aunts, uncles. Okay, so the whole community is involved in the harvest of coffee. So not so bad as far as working conditions are concerned, we'll say. Okay. Okay, so we talked about tea, we talked about coffee. The other beverage that we drink, but we also consume, is cocoa. And cocoa, I'll include that because it oftentimes is grown side by side, in particular with coffee. Okay, so worldwide, more than 3 million tons of cocoa beans are consumed annually. We as Canadians consume about 5.5 kilograms of chocolate per person per year. Okay, and that can vary quite dramatically. Of course, there's some people who never touch chocolate, and then there's obviously people that eat an awful lot of it. So the yearly harvest from one tree, because cocoa, comes from a tree, not a bush. Yearly harvest from one tree results in only a single can of cocoa powder. Okay, so you go to a supermarket and you see a dozen cocoa cans on the shelf. That's the yearly harvest from 12 cocoa trees. So cocoa was discovered by the Mayans in Brazil, and it's a very important commodity, just like tea and coffee, in many of the countries where it is grown. It's certainly very important in many South American countries, but just like coffee, it is now grown worldwide. Okay, so not quite as worldwide as coffee, but it's still grown in 30 countries throughout the world. Today, 67% of cocoa production comes from the West African countries of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Okay, so it's interesting what happens with this. You got tea developed in China, originated in China, and most of the export in the world is coming from Kenya. You have coffee that originate in Ethiopia, and the biggest producer in the world is now Brazil. And you have cocoa, which was discovered in Brazil, but the biggest producer in the world is Africa. So it's interesting how these particular products are now being primarily grown in areas where the plants were not native. So about 90% of the world's cocoa supply is grown and harvested on family-owned farms, okay, with plot sizes of 12 acres or less. So what you're going to find is that a lot of the cocoa, especially in South America and Central America, are being grown by the same families that are growing the coffee. And oftentimes the two are grown side by side, okay? So you get a double cropping, we'll say. In Africa, on the other hand, Ghana and Ivory Coast, there are more of a plantation type of scenario that's going on there. Much larger parcels of land are devoted there to the cocoa production. So when you think about, in particular, a lot of these sort of family-run cocoa farms, most of the family farms are averaging about 350 pounds of cocoa per acre per year, sorry, and that will only generate 30 to 100 bucks per person. Okay, so what we're talking about here essentially is that cocoa, tea, and coffee, all harvested by hand by people who are getting paid very, very little. Okay, if these particular products were being developed and grown in the Western world, Europe or North America, where we had to pay a heck of a lot more for wages, really it's only the wealthiest people in the world that would be able to afford to drink tea or coffee or eat chocolate. It's only because these particular products are growing in what we consider third world countries where people are getting paid so little that we as consumers can afford to consume these particular products. So a cocoa tree, 10 years from seed to getting your first harvest, okay? And then once you got a mature tree, you only get about 20 fruits per year. That's not much when you consider the size of a cocoa tree. You only get 20 fruit. And as I mentioned, that equilibrates to only 1 can of cocoa. Now, on the other hand, the fruit are football sized, okay? So they're much larger than what a cocoa bean or cocoa fruit, or sorry, a coffee plant, sorry, would have, okay? So we got a football-sized fruit. That fruit has to be cut open, again, all by hand. The inner pulpy seed layer is then left in the open to ferment. The rind, on the other hand, is not wasted. That is used to make cocoa butter, which is used then in cosmetic industry. The seeds are extracted from the fermented pulp and then they're dried in the sun and then they're shipped out, primarily to northern markets, we'll say Europe or North America. Those seeds are then roasted and then they're ground to make cocoa powder. Interestingly, South American cocoa is sold primarily in North America. African cocoa is sold primarily in Europe. Okay, so it's a north-south, unlike coffee and tea, which is sort of spreading all over the world. Cocoa production, on the other hand, seems to be a north-south migration as far as from where you're growing your product to where the product is actually being consumed. Here's the flower from a cocoa plant. It actually pops off the trunk of the tree. There's a reason for that. When you have fruit that are basically almost like a Nerf football, each of those fruit weighs several pounds. If that was on the end of a branch, like an apple would be, then these branches would break under the weight of the fruit. So a lot of tropical plants that produce large fruit actually produce the flowers right off the trunk because that's where they have the most strength to survive. So here's sort of looking underneath, and once those fruit have gone from green to this brownish color, eventually they'll turn sort of a yellowy color, yellowy brown, and when they're yellowy brown, they're ready for harvest. So here you can see the fruit in the background, that yellowy color. They cut the fruit, you can see the very thick rind that is used to create cocoa butter, and then the seeds, which are quite large, are coated in sort of this white pulp. And in fact, that white pulp is quite sweet. And in these countries where cocoa is being grown, they actually make a drink from that that's drank locally. The beans are basically then that pulpy layer is spread out, left into a layer that ferments, and that helps then more easily to wash off the pulpy layer. Then those seeds are sun-dried, bagged up, and then shipped off for roasting and then for grinding into powder. One thing I'm going to finish off with is this whole idea of fair trade. Okay, and you oftentimes see it with coffee, fair trade coffee, but you can actually purchase fair trade tea and fair trade cocoa as well. So what happens with fair trade? You have these small family farms, and they're organized into cooperatives. So you have several families in the community, and each of those will basically get together, form a cooperative, which they own and govern themselves. And what they will do then, as a community, they will add a premium to the price of their particular good, okay, to the price of the coffee, the tea, or the cocoa, as far as the market price is concerned. Now, that will translate into a higher cost for us as a consumer, okay? But what happens, they take that extra premium that they've added, and they take that money and they basically reinvest it into their communities, okay? So it helps them with the social, economic investments. So it'll help with education, health services, get better equipment. Basically, it improves the whole situation for the workers for the most part, okay? And in this case, with fair trade, you're not using forced labor of any kind, okay? So in a lot of cases, fair trade have organizers that go out, they check the fair trade farms to make sure they're complying with all the rules of being fair trade. And if there's any kind of children that are working under an age of 15 years, then they can be shut down, okay? So, when you're going out and you're buying that particular product, so feel better about drinking this particular product if you're having fair trade, because you know that there's more money being reinvested back into these communities. And oftentimes these communities are quite poor and they're really relying upon coffee, tea, or cocoa as being their main commodity. That's basically their bread and butter, so to speak. Okay, so there you have it, an overview of it. So just sort of think about it the next time you're out and you're enjoying your cup of coffee. Just think about where that particular product's coming from, and what it took to get that product to the markets.